Hello, UCR students. My name is Joanne Snapp, and today we're going to talk all about letters of recommendation, specifically for pre-health students. So we're going to cover a lot of topics today. Some of those include the requirements, timeline, when to ask, and how to collect those letters of recommendation for your applications. So one thing that's really important as we get started with this discussion is to recognize that there is not going to be a standard or universal set of requirements for every single school. Regardless of what profession you're going into, every school is going to set their own letter of recommendation requirements, which can be really tricky, but truthfully, it ends up being pretty common that most schools are going to ask for 2 science faculty, perhaps a non-science faculty. That's not as common. A lot of people will ask for a non-academic person, and then a lot of schools will ask for a health professional. And so when you make your school list, which truthfully, most people don't make their school list until later in the process, usually in the spring. But if you really, really want to know, what you would do is you would pick out 10 or so schools that you know you want to apply to, or 5, however many, and just go to the websites and cross-check the letter requirements. If you pick your top 5 schools and you make sure you meet the requirements for those schools, you'll be satisfied. It may be the case later that you discover that one of the schools you had selected requires something that maybe you don't have. And in that case, you just have to decide how easy it would be to get that letter or whether you really need to apply to that one school. So cross-checking is your first step. Create an Excel sheet, list your schools, go to their websites, and just make sure that you have everything. I do want to point out that for science letters, that is primarily biology, chemistry, physics. It could be upper div, lower div, so your microbios, anatomy, physio, immunology, biochemistry, all of that is great for science faculty. Non-science faculty would include things like psychology, nutrition, writing, anything outside of the sciences. And then for a non-academic, a job supervisor, your researcher, your PI, your lab manager, sometimes people will ask, well, can my PI be my science faculty? And for a lot of schools, they want you to have a faculty member who has taught you, because the point of the science faculty is for them to comment on your behavior as a student. So if your PI also taught you in a class, then 100% yes. Just ask the PI to write a little bit about their experience with you in their class, in the classroom. If not, then I would, and let's say you can't get another science faculty and one of the only science letters you have is your PI, I would say really have them emphasize you as a learner, handling rigorous content, learning things quickly, think about the behaviors of what a good student would be, have them comment on those things. Okay, who to ask? So I just listed off some of the people. A lot of people worry about whether they can ask a community college professor if they had transferred from a CC. That is absolutely okay. I've always told my transfer students that if you went to, you went to community college for 2 years, you went to UCR for 2 years, then you probably could have one from each, right? But if you had only letters from community college and none from UCR, that might raise a red flag. So if you could get one from each, that's perfect. If you have 2 from UCR, that's perfectly fine too. But I probably wouldn't have none from UCR. If you worked really closely with an advisor, from any department, you can ask them to write you a letter, especially if they know more about your story, your backstory. If you have something that they can talk about that kind of explains a situation. Sometimes if you had a situation in college, an advisor can help explain it in a little bit of a different context. Job supervisors, of course, are wonderful. Just make sure that if you ask somebody who is not part of the health professions, that there is a guide online. If you Google letter writer guide, you will see a document pop up that basically tells people how to write letters of recommendation. Writing a letter of rec for medical school or dental school is very, very different than writing it for any other kind of job. So they really need to understand what the schools are looking for, and they need to be commenting on those qualities about you. And I'm going to show you what those are in just a minute. Any health professional is perfectly fine, but there are some health professions like dental schools that want you to have a letter of rec from a dentist. PA schools, some of them are really expecting that. When it comes to medical school, usually MD schools do not specify that you must have a letter from a physician. However, it's sort of like an unspoken preference that you do. And I have had lots of people who didn't have letters and they were fine. But if you have a letter from a physician, that's great. Obviously, if you have one, you would go for it. For DO schools, it doesn't matter if the letter is from an MD or DO, and same thing for MD. It's okay if you have a DO writing your letter of rec. It's more that they're a physician and they're commenting on what they've observed in you in terms of interacting with other people, patients, teams, things like that. A lot of people worry that, and when it comes to research, that they didn't have a strong relationship with their PI and they had a better relationship with their lab manager. And so they worry about asking the lab manager because they don't have a doctorate or they are not high up on the hierarchy. But honestly, if your PI wrote you a letter but it said absolutely nothing, I would say that would be worse than having a really strong letter from a lab manager who can name really specific qualities about you and provide examples. If you're super worried about this, you could always ask the lab manager and the PI to co-sign the letter. So perhaps the lab manager would write the letter and then the PI would co-sign it. That kind of gives, I guess, the validity that you're looking for. But at the end of the day, I would always ask the person who knows you best. It is always better to have a stronger letter from somebody who can actually say things about you. And the same thing is true when it comes to faculty. Sometimes, I know we've all had those classes where the professor was hardly ever there. They came in, they lectured for a little bit, but you really built stronger relationships with the TAs. You spent most of the time in those small groups with the TAs, and sometimes the TAs even taught the class. So if you have a situation like that where you really never got to know your professor, I would always go and ask the TA if the TA would be comfortable writing you a letter of rec. And then you can go to your professor and say, Dr. So-and-so, Jessica agreed to write me a letter of rec for your course. Would you be willing to read it and co-sign the letter? And usually if you ask a professor to write you a letter of rec and they don't know you at all, they'll actually forward your email to the TA anyway and ask the TA if they knew you. And if the TA knew and liked you, then they would probably ask the TA to write the letter anyway. So I think that starting with the TA, if you're really stuck, would be the sort of like last ditch effort. You really, in the most ideal way, you really wouldn't want your TA only, submitting a letter for you. You would want the professor's signature on the letter. But it is another way to get to the professor if the TA and the professor work closely together. I often get asked what counts as a science letter. So I think this is, again, a little bit, a little subjective, but not really. If somebody teaches a biochemistry class and they have a degree in biochemistry and the class is clearly called biochemistry, but it's out of the nutrition department, then that would clearly be a biochemistry class. So that's a science class. So that would work. But if they're teaching some other class that is not really a science class, nutrition is not technically considered a science. I know that's debatable, but it's not in the med school's eyes considered a science class. So if you took any other nutrition courses, then that would not be considered. Kind of the same thing with cognitive science or neuroscience. Sometimes psychology or cognitive science offers some pretty science heavy courses. The person writing the letter, if you want them to write it as a science letter, I would just let them know that that's what you're intending and ask them to focus on your ability to handle a rigorous science course load. And so they could make that clear in the course, in the letter by describing the course in terms of it being a science course. So if you are asking someone outside of a science department, you just have to work with them a little bit and just be honest with them about what you need. And hopefully they will help you with that. Sometimes people who work at UCR leave UCR, they retire or they get a new job. And if you had a really strong relationship with them, you may still want to ask them for a letter, which is okay. So if they don't work at UCR anymore, they can still write you a letter. However, they do need to have the letter on letterhead. That's really important. And if they don't work at UCR, they probably have letterhead at their new institution, which might feel a little weird having a letter from a different institution. However, that person would just write very clearly that they knew you at UCR and how they knew you, and then they can mention that they now, work somewhere else. But even though they're not at UCR, they still have to use the letterhead. They can't just submit a blank piece of paper with a letter on it. So that's just part of the process. It's okay. As long as they mention how they knew you, where they knew you, and all of that. If a professor retired, then they often do have access to the letterhead, even after they retire. So that's okay. Letters can be co-signed. It's not super common, but it is a thing. If you feel like two people who work very closely together kind of go in together. Usually we only do things like that when it comes to TAs and faculty or lab managers and PIs where there's some kind of issue with hierarchy. But that is a thing, and people can do that if that's kind of like the last resort. Okay, so the letter requirements again are based on your school list. If you have one school that asks you for a letter that you don't have, it would probably be way easier to just remove that school from the school list. Now, if that happens to be your dream school, then you're going to have to figure that out. But if you don't have a letter from somebody, there's really nothing you can do about it if you just genuinely don't have that. And it's really stressful, and I understand that, and it can create a lot of turmoil because you want to apply to the school. At the same time, this is why if you're in your first or second year doing this activity of like popping in, checking schools requirements, I would always tell people to check the school's requirements on their website, because the schools are going to change their requirements from time to time. And, we don't all get a text notification when they change requirements. So it's very important for you as applicants to always be checking the requirements. Just set a reminder that maybe once or twice a year you pop into schools' admissions pages and check out the requirements. That's a really safe way to make sure that you know ahead of time what it is that you need to do. If you wait till the spring that you're applying to check this out, then yeah, you may be left scrambling at the last minute. All right, so what do you think the schools want the letter writers to say about you? This may seem like a mystery, kind of like when people say, well, what do med schools or what do whoever want from me? It's not that much of a mystery because the schools have created core competencies, and this can be found, a whole description on core competencies can be found by Googling AAMC core competencies. Now, these are written for medical schools, but truthfully, almost all the health professions are going to, if you look their competencies up, are going to be very, very similar to this. This is a really nice comprehensive list, so that's why I use this one. So if you were to go look these up and read about them, you would see, things like collaborating with others or public speaking, working well with others, showing up, reliability, dependability. You can see how easy it would be for letter writers to be able to comment on some of those things, especially science faculty who may not know you very well. And so the science competency part in the last bullet there is really your ability to do science. And that's what you want the letter writer to ultimately say about you. But if they can also say, hey, this is a really great student who shows up to class, sits in the front row, participates, when we do group projects in lab, always helps others. Those are the other kind of side behaviors that we really hope they'll comment on, in addition to just, hey, this person did really well in my class. We can see they did really well in the class from your grades, right? So that doesn't actually help too much. The expectation for science letters, truthfully, is not that high. A lot of science faculty don't know you personally, which is normal. They don't know your whole life story. They're not going to be commenting on a lot of very personal things about you. So they only have so much to work with. And so the science faculty letters are usually not very, very compelling. They're just really good. Like, hey, this person did really well in my class, is a really strong student, participates, has a great attitude. Those are the things they're looking for in that letter. The other people who write you letters, maybe who got to know you a little bit more, those would be the ones we would want to comment on who you are, how your background maybe impacts your decisions, how you behave outside of the classroom. So don't panic. Don't worry if you don't feel like you have a really strong personal relationship with your faculty, your science faculty. When some of these classes are, 3 or 4 or 500 people in them, it's honestly really hard to build that relationship. Some people do, but not everybody can. They just simply don't have the time to build a relationship with 500 students. So you do the best you can. So when do you ask for letters of rec? Well, the quick answer is when the time is right. And when is the time right? Sometimes people feel like they've built a really strong relationship with somebody and it just feels like the right time. So let's say you had a really great course with a professor, you're chatting every day after class, they're talking to you. At the end of that class, when the quarter is over, that might be a really good time to ask for the letter, especially if you're not going to be able to take another class with them. And so you would go down after class, shake their hand, thank them for a great course, and then say, I'm going to be applying to dental school in 2 years. I know that's far away, but do you think you'd be willing to write me a letter of recommendation based on my interactions with you in this class? I've had a great experience, and I feel like, always compliment them. I think you'd be the best person to really comment on my ability to handle a rigorous science course load. Um, and then they'll probably say, yeah, absolutely, email me, send me your stuff. And so we're going to talk about what that means in just a minute. Sometimes the right time is, when you're shadowing someone after you've spent a decent amount of time with them. I would never ask for a letter of rec after, shadowing once or twice. I would probably try to have a conversation with them that's a little bit deeper before you ask for that. If they offer it though, if they know all you're there is to get the letter of rec and they offer it, that's fine. But it's still hard if they don't know you for them to say something positive about you. They'll probably have a template that they give you. Ideally, you would ask by March of the year that you are applying. So if you, like I said, if you feel like the time is right and it's a year before or whenever, you can ask, and they're probably not going to write the letter right that minute, or they'll write it and they'll save it on their desktop. But when you are applying, the time to ask would be by March of that year. So the reason we want to do by March is because sometimes they don't always respond to your emails. So you may email in March and then they don't respond to you. And then 2 weeks later, you need to email them again. And then they don't respond to you. And maybe you need to email a third time. So we usually give them a couple of weeks between each round of emailing. At that point, a month has gone by. It's April and the application opens in May. So ideally, you would ask around January and give yourself plenty of time to do the follow-up. And the very worst case scenario, they ghost you, they don't respond to you, which honestly does happen. Then you have time to scramble and find somebody different. Personally, if it were me doing it, I would scramble and find as many people as possible at the beginning and ask all of them and then see who says yes. If you're dealing with one or two people at a time, you might drag the process out longer especially if they're people who you're not super close with. If you are just asking faculty who you kind of barely knew, I would probably ask more at the beginning and see how it works out. You do want to give letter writers more than a month to write the letter. You definitely do not want to ask and then say, oh yeah, the deadline is in 2 weeks. That's really very disrespectful to professionals, and they see that way. So just make sure you're giving them a solid month. If you do ask earlier than the year you're applying, they are not going to give you the letter. They should not. They shouldn't. They have nowhere to put the letter. So they're just going to hold on to that letter. And then unless you want to open up an Interfolio account. So Interfolio is an account that you create, you have to pay for, and it basically stores letters of rec. So could you possibly write or open an Interfolio account 2 years early and collect them? Yes. The problem is that the letter will be dated 2 years old. So when you finally connect it to the application, it'll be dated too early. You really want the letter dated within a year of the time you're applying. So even if you ask, let's say a year in advance, you can, if it's a year in advance, you can go ahead and create an Interfolio account and you can go ahead and add the letter writers in, and then they will upload the letter into Interfolio and it'll just stay there until you're ready to apply. So do you ask in person or by email? And I have always said either is totally fine. I've talked to a lot of faculty at different universities, and what they tell me is that they actually prefer that you email them. I think students have this idea in their head that you need to go and meet with them and have coffee and tell them your whole life story in order to get a letter of rec. But in truth, they don't need all of that to write you a letter of rec. They really just need to know, what they want to know, which is, how did you experience their course? They'll have certain questions for you. Some of them actually have a form you fill out. Some of them have like a little mini application you fill out to get a letter of rec from them. But truthfully, do whatever is most appropriate for you. And I would say based on your relationship with the person. So if this is a relationship where you have normally gotten coffee, then yeah, ask them to coffee and ask in person. That makes sense. If you've never had a conversation with this person, I would feel strange just having a random coffee with someone I've never had coffee with before for the sole purpose of asking them to do something for me. I would personally write a really nice email, very professional email with a lot, all the details in it, and ask them over email. And I feel like that would work just as fine for most faculty. If you're talking to them in class, you can also ask after class or, during office hours. That's always a good time, especially after you've had a really nice conversation. So whenever you are asking for letters of rec, one way to really stand out and look professional is to create a letter packet. And a letter packet is simply a PDF that you attach to the request when you email them. And so when you email each person and ask for a letter, you really want to write a nice, professional cover letter to ask them. And I'm going to show you a sample of that. And so that will be in the body of your email. But I would also take that nice request that you've written and put it as the cover of your letter packet. So the letter packet, they open it up, it's their, the first page is the request. The second page is maybe your personal statement. Third page is your resume. Sometimes people want to include their transcripts in there, especially if there is a story to tell from your transcripts. For example, if you maybe struggled in your first year, but then you have a really drastic upward trend and you are hoping your letter writer might comment on that, it would be best to attach your transcript so they can actually see that for themselves and they can comment on that. So if you feel comfortable adding your transcript, that's totally fine too. But I would PDF this as one PDF. Don't attach 3 PDFs. One PDF and say, label it letter packet, your name. And I would upload that, or I would attach that in your email when you ask them, because then it shows that you're organized and you're professional. And they almost always will say, yeah, send me your information. So you send them the information before they even ask for it. And if they don't want it, they'll just delete it. If they don't want to write you a letter, I mean. But it's really nice for them to have that. When they open that document and they look, they'll see how organized you are, how nice everything looks. And then that'll make them want to write you the letter even more. Some people are super disorganized, honestly, in this process, and they are asking for letters. Their emails look sloppy. They say, hey, instead of dear. There's, grammatical mistakes. They're not even using complete sentences. And then they don't offer up any information. And it just, from the professor's point of view, or any person who writes you a letter of rec, when they send that letter with their name on it, they're risking their entire credibility on you. Because if you go to that school and you end up being a problem for the school, they'll go look at the application. They'll say, when dental or medical or PA students end up being problems, they'll actually go look at the application and say, what were the red flags? Like, why didn't we catch that this person was a problem? And they'll go look at the letter writers. And let's say you're someone who writes letters for a lot of students at that school. If you recommended someone who is a problem, they are not going to care about your letter ever again. You have lost credibility. And all professional people know this. And so they don't want to write letters for people who are potential red flags. And so you need to make sure for your letter writers, you are coming across as extremely professional, mature, ready to do this. Because if you are kind of stumbling into their office hours a mess every week, or you're telling them all about your life drama and it's not good, they're going to be less likely to write you a letter, or they may write one that says something you don't want them to say. So make sure that you're keeping it together when you're talking to your faculty and you're always presenting yourself as the most professional. So here's an example of an email that I wrote this as a draft, that you could send, that's sort of giving them a signal for remembering you, because sometimes in our classes they have a lot of students and they can't always remember people. A couple tricks to help them remember you. Obviously, sitting in the front row of class, or if you're in a Zoom class, like always having your camera on is really important. But when you go down to class, at the end of class, go down to the podium and introduce yourself. Stick out your hand and introduce yourself. And even if there's a line of students wanting to talk to them, stand in line and wait and talk to them. Don't be the first one to jump up and run out the door at the end of class. Then on your email, I would change your profile to your picture of your face, a very clear picture of your face. Then email them, after the class and say, this has been such an interesting class. I really am loving this. Thank you so much for teaching. And they're going to see your face. They're going to see your picture on your email, and they're going to have that email as, as evidence. They'll remember you. Then you go down again after the next day in class and you are sitting in the front row and you're engaging. You don't have to be obnoxious about it, but you definitely can show interest. And so after you've kind of had a few interactions with them, if you have, let's say you had a conversation about this person who was a snowboarder and they came in on crutches. So they may not remember you 2 years later. So they give them this person gave them, a reminder of who they were. I always, compliment them in a genuine way and share what you really enjoyed about their class because truthfully, people like people who, like what they like. So we are generally more interested in people when they care about what we care about. So what do professors care about? Well, they care about what they're teaching. They care about their content. So if they're standing up there and their sole job is to teach you organic chemistry, that's their mission, right? They want you to do well in organic chemistry. So even if you hate organic chemistry, you can still say, I enjoyed, learning the way you taught. This was a really challenging course for me. It really pushed me to think about, science in a different way, or just give them something that shows that as a student, you were actually really engaged in the learning process. And so you don't have to have straight A's to ask for letters of rec from your professors. Even if you got a B or even a C in their class, sometimes you can have a great story from a C, a class with a C. I've had people who've told me they failed the class, they retook it, and they got a letter from the original professor because they retook the class and they learned and grew so much during that process. And the professor really grew to love them because of how hard they worked and grew as a student. So if that happened to you where you were really struggling with the class and then you went to office hours and you asked for help and you asked the teacher, how should I be learning in this class? Like, give me tips, and you changed your methods and you did really well at the end, even if really well is a B, they can talk a lot more about you than someone who just got an A and never showed up to anything. So make sure you remind them of your experience in their class, tell them about whatever you did, tutoring, studying, study groups, everything, just tell them all about it. And then you can see that you want to ask very humbly. I'm writing to ask if you would consider writing a letter of recommendation. Don't say, will you write me a strong letter of rec? That's really off-putting for someone who has had lots of requests for letters. I'm always a little bothered by that request because obviously if I don't think I can write you a strong letter, I'm not going to write you a letter. You could ask, like, would you be willing to support my application with a letter of recommendation? So that word support suggests that, they're supporting you. But I personally wouldn't. I've had other faculty also tell me that they don't like being asked if they would write a strong letter. And then tell them what you hope that they would say about you. So they say, I hope that you would be able to comment on my ability to persist with difficult material, which if you remember back to the competencies, that is one of the competencies. So after they say yes, then you send them a thank you email, give them some directions, and I would give them a deadline. You can either give them May 1st or June 1st. We're going to talk about timelines. You can attach your PDF again and just remind them that you have to have it signed and on letterhead. And I'll obviously thank them. If you get closer to the deadline and nothing has happened, they haven't uploaded the letter yet, you could always write them a really nice handwritten thank you card and thank them for being willing to write you a letter and drop it off at their office or mail it to them. If someone gets a really nice thank you card, they're going to be more likely to write your letter faster. Or if you're in the area and you have, some chocolates or cookies or something you want to drop off, like, nobody is going to hate receiving a little tiny gift. I wouldn't give them a gift card. I wouldn't give them anything of value. You don't want it to seem like you're bribing them or anything. But, if you want to give them a small token of appreciation, again, I don't think anybody is going to hate that. So it's just a way to help maybe nudge them along to write your letter of rec a little sooner if you need that. Whatever you do, do not harass your letter writers. If you told them May 1st and it's, 3 days before, do not write them a hastily written email about how they need to get it done by the deadline. If they miss your deadline, do not email them and tell them they missed your deadline. That is the fastest way to get a bad letter of rec. Just be nice. Continue to thank them. And you really truthfully don't need your letter until July, so there's no reason to harass them. Okay, so again, collecting letters, we can use Interfolio or we can use the centralized application. When your application opens, you can add the letter writers in at that time. The only the only profession that generally uses Interfolio are medical school applicants. The rest of the professions typically just use the centralized application. And when you add them in, they get notified and they will upload the letter into the application themselves. You do not handle the letter. You don't ask for the letter. You don't see the letter. Sometimes they will give you the letter. Sometimes they will ask you to write your own letter. But you are not uploading that letter yourself. They are uploading that for you. So AMCAS lets you put up to 10 letters into the application. And this is the only application system that lets you do this, but you can divvy out which letters go to which schools. So because UCR doesn't have a committee letter, you're going to use individual letters. And that means that let's say you have 6 letters, you don't have to release all 6 letters to every single school. You can do 4 here and a different combo of 4 in another school. Let's say you have a professor or a physician who graduated from UCR School of Medicine, and they want to write a letter directed to UCR School of Medicine about why you're such an amazing fit. You can have them upload that and then only release that letter to UCR, obviously. So that's the benefit of AMCAS. It lets you do that. ACOMAS and every other application, you can see what the cap is for letters, but they go to every single school. You can't choose which ones go where. You really don't need 10 letters of rec. Highly recommend not putting 10 letters of rec in your application, and certainly not releasing all of those to every single school. So when do you need your letters by? So here's what happens. The applications open in May, and if you give them a May 1st deadline, then you know you can add them in May, and they'll get the email, and then they'll upload it anytime in the month of May. And if they don't upload it by May 1st, obviously that's okay because you're just opening your application on May 1st, so it's not that big of a deal. Add your letter writers in early, like when you first open your app. That way they have more time, they get the email, and then that just gives them more opportunity to get it done. But you do not need to have your letters in your application in order to submit your application. If your application is filled out and ready to go, you can submit it without your letters. As long as your letter writers are entered in, even if they haven't uploaded the letter, you're fine. In June, you're going to submit your application. And so in June, the only thing happening is that your app is being verified. For dental, PA, and osteopathic, you may want your letters in by June because that's when they will start screening applications. For AMCAS, for MD, you really don't need it in by June because they are not getting your applications till the end of June. But you don't need your letters in the application in order to be verified. So your app can be verified and sent to schools even if your letters are not there. So when do you really need your letters? If you're applying to medical school, you're going to get your secondaries around the first week of July. And you usually want to submit your secondaries by the end of July or middle of August. So you need your letters of rec in by the time you're submitting your secondaries. You can submit your secondaries, but they're not going to read your application until your letters of rec are in the application. So that by mid-July is the absolute latest that I would say you need your letters uploaded by. So just to summarize, the ways you're going to get good letters of rec, first of all, don't be afraid to ask. They're very used to this. You are not the first person to ask them, likely. So you're going to have to, just like you talk to patients, you're going to have the courage to ask for letters. Part of this process is actually just it's like a rite of passage. Every person who is a professional has asked for letters of rec. Every person who has a graduate degree and above has asked for letters of rec. So they know that this is part of the process. Your professors know that. Every professional person knows that you need letters of rec to move on in your life. And so you don't have to be afraid or ashamed or embarrassed or anything like that. It's just a very normal part of life. But what they do decide is either how good your letter is or whether they want to write it for you. Because there are lots of people asking for letters. So being engaged is the very, very first step. Smile, laugh, talk to them, be normal, just chat with them after class. But it's not just being nice. You also need to be impressive. So if I were writing a letter for someone who came into my class 15 minutes late, complained about their test grade and told me that I write my test questions poorly and, got a C in my class because he was, obviously not studying, never asked me for help, I would absolutely not write them a letter of rec. I would be like, get this person out of my class as fast as possible. So you can't be a problem and then ask them to write you a letter. That makes no sense. You need to be professional. So when you write emails throughout the entire quarter, you need to make sure all of your emails are professional. I have literally seen emails to professors where the student will start with, hey, Dr. So-and-so, or even worse, like, hey, and use their first name. Don't say hey, don't say hi, say hello, or dear, or good morning, and then with a comma, and then write it like a letter. I know in our text era, everyone wants to use acronyms like, IDK. Don't do that in your emails. That may be very normal for you. It is not very normal for the rest of us. And so you need to, write professionally. If you're going into professional school, you need to start acting like you're a professional. Even in college. I know that sounds crazy, but you do. All right, act right in class. Well, again, what does that mean? Like, don't sit there and talk when the professor is talking. I've sat in on science classes at another UC, and I was appalled. I was so embarrassed for the students for how they were behaving. I saw students watching YouTubes while the professor was lecturing. Some of them had like a full meal out on their tables while the professor was lecturing. Some of them are rolling in like pajamas, look like they just rolled out of bed. I'm not saying you can never wear pajama pants to class, but if you're going to walk into a professor's office and ask them to write you a letter of rec, I would personally put on a pair of jeans and just put on a shirt. I would want to look professional when I asked for a letter of rec. So, again, if you want them to treat you like a professional, then you have to act like a professional. And then be genuine. They like you if you like what they're doing. So pay attention, figure out what you really liked about their class, tell them, be honest, share when you really liked something. If something was really interesting, tell them you enjoyed learning it. You don't have to lie, like don't lie if you hated their class, but there has to be some science class that you genuinely loved. Otherwise, why are you doing this? You have to like science on some level. So whenever you like a class and it's really enjoyable for you, don't be shy. Go tell them how much you love it. And, just like you compliment your girly friend for having great nails or whatever, go tell that professor, I love that class. And so they will love you if you do that, because most people don't do that, right? Like they teach these classes all day, every day, and you guys stare at them and you look miserable and they think everybody hates them. So if you go up and tell them how much you love their lecture, they're going to be so flattered. They're going to love you. They're going to be like, yes, I love this person. So that's just actually a generally nice thing to do for any person. Okay. Fun facts about letters. All of your professors needed letters to get to where they are, so they absolutely know this is part of the process. Again, don't feel bad asking. Letters need to be signed and on letterhead. This is super important. So make sure that whenever you get to that point and someone is writing you a letter, that you just, nicely remind them of that. And then if you are graduating and taking a year off, I would ask for letters before you graduate. The longer you are away from campus, the harder it is to get in contact with people. And because they have all the current undergrads in their face, they are not going to remember you from 2 years before. So ask them before, tell them your timeline, and then stay in touch with them. Make sure that you connect with them every 6 months or so, remind them where you are in your journey, thank them again for offering to write you a letter, let them know your timeline, but don't just disappear for 2 years and then hope that they'll remember you. Okay, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to schedule an appointment with one of the PPAC advisors and we could definitely go through this with you. And I hope to see you at our next workshop.